Good afternoon or good morning. My name is Charlene Brown, and I am a senior fellow at the Croatan Institute. I also serve as director of our REASE program, which stands for Racial Equity, Economics, Finance, and Sustainability. Thank you for joining today's conversation, which is part of our Redirecting Capital Racial Equity series. Today, we'll be talking about how investors can leverage their fixed income allocations in pursuit of racial equity outcomes. Before we get started, however, a few housekeeping items. This session is being recorded. If you are joining us by Zoom, please use the Q&A box for all questions. If you are joining us on LinkedIn, please write your questions in the comment box. This session is being offered simply for educational purposes only and is not intended to be investment advice. Please consult with a professional if you are seeking investment advice. I'd like to just take a moment to thank the Nathan Cummings Foundation and Trillium Asset Management for their support of Reefs and this body of work. You can find additional resources on our website. So last October, we published Capital at a Crossroads, which is a paper that takes a total portfolio activation approach to racial equity. In addition, we have done some other webinars, one on cash allocation and the other on venture capital. So please also consult with those resources if you're looking to learn more about the series. So before we begin, just a little bit of framing for today's conversation. This conversation is intended to be about 40 to 50 minutes with the panelists. And then we'll open up for questions from the audience and for about 15 minutes before closing out. To frame the conversation, we'd like to offer the definition of racial equity investing, which is the definition that we offered in the paper that was released last year based on the conversations that we had with stakeholders in the industry. What we generally found is that the concept of racial equity is one that has been embraced by many investors and asset managers. However, there was a lack of definition among many stakeholders. And so we formulated one which we think encompasses the three essential pieces that are necessary for us to actually say that we're doing thematic investing called racial equity investing. The first of which is that racial equity investing must dismantle racist systems and structures. I think each of us recognize that organizations and systems within our society, particularly here in the United States, given the legacy of slavery and discrimination that has persisted for communities of color, realize that these systems have to be changed. And part of that change is really an assumption that we need to do a lot of work around evaluating processes and systems that continue to perpetuate discrimination, even if it's implicit. The second piece of which is focused on the redirection of capital. So reallocating capital to support opportunities for communities of color. I think this is piece where the industry broadly has had some success. There's lots of investing that has been done targeting community investing historically. But oftentimes we have not had the very explicit conversations around the history of the United States and the racist structures which perpetuate the inequality that we see in our nation. The third piece of this definition is focused on measurements of outputs and outcomes. So I think it's necessary that as we're working for systems change and we're reallocating capital, that we actually look to measure the outcomes because we should be seeing positive change. And I would argue that if we're not seeing positive change, then something isn't quite right, and that we need to retool how we're thinking and engaging with communities of color. I think ultimately, if we're successful, what this type of investing will lead to is increased opportunities for communities of color, which means increased wealth. And hopefully the numbers that we see that I think, those of you on this line have seen in terms of the racial wealth gap, we will begin to see that shrink. So we're using this definition to frame today's conversation. And so without further delay, let me introduce our panelists, and then we'll jump into that conversation. Today I'm joined by Danielle Burns of C-Note, Justin Conway with Calvert Impact Capital, Homero Radway with activists, and David Sand with community capital management. So I'd like each of you to just do a brief introduction of yourselves and your organizations and share with us how your firm is leveraging fixed income investments to achieve racial equity outcomes and what makes your approach distinctive. So Danielle, how about you?
Yeah, Charlene, thanks so much for having me today. Delighted to be part of the conversation. Danielle Burns, I'm the Vice President, Head of Business Development here on Team C-Note. Been in the impact investing space. I can't even believe I'm going to say this, but pushing 18 years. And I've been with Team C-Note for 3 of those. And prior to joining C-Note, worked in a registered investment advisory firm focusing, 100% on impact in the public side of the space. But over the past few years, I really wanted to, double down on my personal commitment of supporting communities like that of which I grew up in, Charlene. I'm originally from Brooklyn, New York. I grew up in a low to moderate income community where, didn't have access to financial literacy and opportunity and just all the things that, we typically tend to take for granted to help us be the best versions of ourselves. And so how could I, really support those efforts? And so I wanted to double down on that and focus on community investing. And so my work here at C-Note allows me to do that. Thinking about, C-Note in terms of we are a women-led, women-founded impact investment platform, and our number one goal is to close the racial wealth gap. That is, what we do, full stop. And with relation to racial equity, we're really addressing that through C-Note's Wisdom Fund solution. The Wisdom Fund is a fixed income vehicle that is aims to increase capital access and lending opportunities for women, specifically women of color-owned businesses. This is a very specific and direct approach, as we believe at C-Note that women of color are the investment opportunity of the century and really the key to closing the racial wealth gap. The Wisdom Fund is a co-created effort with community development financial institutions, CDFIs, really as a way to bring new thinking, experimentation, and sustainable solutions to drive wealth creation for women of color in the United States. So thank you for having me.
Justin?
Thanks, Charlene, for having me as well. It's great to be here with folks. Some I've had the fortune to know for decades, and some new people here I'm excited to get to know, as I hope to learn from the discussion as well. I'm Justin Conway with Calvert Impact Capital. We're an impact investment manager helping people and institutions invest for racial, gender, economic, and climate justice. So we really build financial products that are trying to address our urgent global challenges, like racial inequity that we're talking about today. Everything we do kind of has is focused on having a measurable social and environmental impact in communities. And every day I have the privilege of working with all types of investors and financial professionals and trying to steer capital towards solutions that people on the planet need. So, for Calvert Impact Capital and our focus on racial equity, our mission is really rooted in addressing structural inequities. And so racial inequity is, an explicit focus and has been since our founding. Our flagship product, the Community Investment Note, has been addressing that for over 26 years and trying to support organizations that combat structural racism in low-income communities around the U.S. So many in our portfolio, many of our U.S. portfolio partners, they would say their mission is really a response to structural racism as they're working to ensure equitable access to housing, healthcare, education, quality jobs, and wealth building opportunities. Across the portfolio, we evaluate every investment we make on their internal diversity, equity, inclusion practices. We collect demographic data on leadership, boards, clients, and all, and we report that to our investors. Our latest report would show that 80% of our portfolios and clients are people of color. Beyond the note, since May of 2020, summer of 2020, we've been very focused on working in deep collaboration and partnership with public and private organizations and community development financial institutions to launch 4 small business recovery funds that are now active across 18 states. And probably growing in the future. But those funds are intentionally designed to address inequities and how capital is traditionally allocated and accessed, and have been successful so far in reaching populations traditionally excluded, including very small, sometimes considered unbankable businesses, and 65% of them owned by women or people of color.
Thank you, Camaron.
Mayor Radway. I'm part of the ActiveVest team. ActiveVest is an investment research firm that analyzes racial, social, and economic justice risks in the municipal market. Our work is centered around a fiscal justice framing, which is our intersectional approach to fiscal health and racial justice. So much of the work I do is really looking at how cities spend money and thinking about how that money is then treated as an investment in marginalized communities and Black people, and thinking about how do we have, and I love that you all are thinking about measuring impact, but how do we measure the impact and think about how to have all the seats at the table filled with all the people in the community that can share what they really need and want from their cities and want from their city financing. And so that's the work we do in trying to stay connected to grassroots communities in cities, to be informed about what they need, what they want, and information that is helpful for them to fight for it. And then as well as helping investors to really be impact aligned, thinking about how to make sure that the things they think they're investing in are really helping the people they want to help. And so we try to put the math and the quant to bond math to get all that done. And I bring together experience as a credit analyst and a trader, underwriter, and portfolio manager to kind of, as a team, we all put that all together to make it work. How we're unique is something that I'm really proud of. We spent a lot of time speaking to organizations in cities and in communities, and using that data to then understand the financial risks and the impact that is having on communities from, I think, a very unique perspective. And so I think that's the way that I'm really encouraged by how we're unique. We're also not a screener of impact. So we're not trying to exclude investments, but more trying to think about all the ways that race impact our daily lives and find a better way to approach getting value out of that for all the people and for Black people.
And I guess I'm batting cleanup here. I'm David Sand. I'm the Chief Impact Strategist at Community Capital Management. Greetings to everyone, old friends and new. CCM is a impact money management firm. We only do impact. We only invest in the United States. We're coming up on 22 years old, so been in business a little bit longer than some of the other folks that are out there, and certainly happy and delighted to see the field growing in the way that it is. We have $4 billion in assets under management. Our clients direct us to invest their money either in particular geographies within the United States or in alignment with one or more of 18 impact themes that we've developed over the years. Some of the ones that we work on is affordable home ownership, affordable rental housing, small business development, environmental sustainability. There's a whole list on our website. And what's interesting and what I hope we'll get to talk about on this panel today is the journey that we've had and that our clients have taken us on in evolving from a focus on low and moderate income as the target for their investment dollars and for trying to put money to work in a way that helps people get better and more efficient access to the capital markets, to a more targeted and focused area of concentration, specifically around bridging the racial wealth gap. In our case, because so much of our work is related to home ownership, specifically around addressing the racial wealth gap in home ownership rates. And we've had a lot of work that we've done, partnered and collaborated with a lot of folks. I think some of them are on the attendee list for this webinar, where we've been able to work with clients and counterparties and CDFIs and other folks, advocacy groups, in getting specific data around minority home ownership and letting us increase our dollars that go specifically to borrowers of color in the home ownership space and businesses run by entrepreneurs of color or with high employment numbers of workforce of color. And that's been part of the expansion, worthy and needed expansion of the impact investment field. And I think that's continuing, and hopefully we'll have some time to talk some more about that.
Well, thank you. Thank you for those introductions. So, as I said, there's a real focus on the systemic piece. And so I kind of want to start there. I'd love to get your thoughts about what systemic change looks like for each of you, and what types of changes do you think can be achieved through your particular strategy? So maybe Justin and David, and then we can bring in Camaron and Danielle.
Sure. I'd mention, that our products are very much about addressing structural inequities and race, gender, et cetera. And so much of the impact and the change that we see really happens at the individual or community level. I think in the prep call for the Charlene, we were talking about how it's not just about kind of number of clients served, but trying to really understand the change that has happened in people's lives. Some of that, I think the field has done a lot of ways, kind of getting that qualitatively for some time. And I think, there are a number of industry efforts that we're part of as well that are trying to be able to kind of bring a more holistic approach and kind of the impact of our individual portfolios. I think on a more macro level, our work is really aimed at changing the way capital is allocated, where, how, and to whom capital is going. How do we make sure that gets more into real service to people and the planet? And so I think the systemic change, it's going to require, all investors to work together and understand the impact of our portfolio, really try to integrate this deeper and deeper into our investment policies and practices. But ultimately, it's going to have to, really challenge and kind of consider the power aspect in terms of who is making the decisions, both at kind of the manager level and at the community level, all throughout. And how those decisions are made. I think that is key. So hopefully we spend some more time on that in this discussion. And I also think it's important to challenge or rethink some of the risk, right? How do we change some of the historically racist underwriting practices, whether it's kind of use of appraisals and credit scores, among other things that are a real challenge. I think we'd also admit that there's so much for us still to learn and get better at. That's why we're certainly pleased to be here. And ultimately, we're going to have to work together and kind of on a more collective front to change the financial system, and certainly at the national policy level. And so it's going to continue to require deeper and deeper collaboration across the board between those of us here and many of the others in our industry.
Yeah, just picking up on what Justin said, unfortunately, if you're looking for areas of historic and structural racism, it's kind of everywhere you turn. But two areas that we try to address or redress, redlining, which we all know about, and it's now illegal, but the echoes and the waves of it continue generation after generation. And one of the ways that is essential to look at redlining for financial services and to counter the legacy of redlining is to be more affirmative and proactive in directing capital in the way that all of us here on this call try to do into those communities that have been historically disenfranchised and towards those individuals who've been historically disenfranchised. And we think there are tools within the capital markets that we and others deploy that can help, at least directionally. And then the other one is around sustainability and climate change impacts. It's still not widely accepted and perceived how much the front line of climate change is low and moderate income communities. And every time there's a natural disaster, we focus on the natural disaster and we see that it's related to climate change, but we don't always see that it's the brunt of it is the people in the communities least equipped to handle it because of where they've been located, because of the underinvestment that's gone into those geographies, those businesses, those homeowners in those communities. So we encourage our clients, and our clients thankfully encourage us when we're looking at climate mitigation, climate change mitigation strategies to focus them on communities of color where they can do the most to help and hopefully, help with resilience to withstand what seems to be coming our way, whether we like it or not.
I'll just add, from our perspective, the most crucial component of the systemic change that we're all working towards is really, investing in women of color, specifically Black women, as a really critical piece of the puzzle when we think about addressing systemic poverty and economic inequality. Black women represent a tremendous GDP opportunity for our country. McKinsey did a study a couple of years ago, and that stated, if Black-owned businesses could reach financial parity with their white counterparts in terms of revenue, that would represent close to an additional $200 billion in annual GDP, which is huge. The C-Note Wisdom Fund was really designed to, thinking about what Justin just was talking about in terms of underwriting challenges. The C-Note Wisdom Fund was really designed to help us think about how we can women of color receive and think about access to capital or getting capital. Last summer, our team embarked on a couple journeys with regards to that specifically. And that was to do a data analysis to think about how, where's this data? When you're asking people, well, women of color, they're a risk, a credit risk, what's the data to really support that? And you sort of get crickets because there hasn't been any to show that they are indeed a credit risk. And so we embarked on a data analysis, and we did a human-centered design approach because we don't want to pretend to know the story and how women of color entrepreneurs are navigating the challenges. And so we wanted to hear directly from them, right? How and where is the system failing them in terms of getting this access to capital? On the data front, some out of those findings, it was full stop. Women of color are not riskier borrowers than other demographics. And statistically, there was no significant difference between the credit risk of women of color and other borrowers. Additionally, women of color on average had a lower credit risk than men specifically, and they had a lower default rate between 2 to 5% compared to their white male. And then lastly, what was really interesting is that despite those findings, women of color still typically receive loan rates that were higher, interest rates that were higher, and came with all types of other stipulations that other demographics didn't have. And then lastly, on the HCD front, this was an amazing five-month journey that we went on where we engaged with over 75 women of color entrepreneurs to really gain insights on how lenders can better serve them. We wanted to connect with CDFI partners as well to understand some of the challenges that they were facing when it came to lending to women of color. And so out of that, both the data analysis and that HCD front, The women actually help us to identify solutions to some of these challenges, right? And it was offering larger loans at, more flexible loan terms, or having credit lines to address with, working capital needs. Really, I think David and Justin may have alluded to this, but really thinking about how we can revamp the credit scoring system to really more accurately reflect credit worthiness for individuals. Getting a standardized loan application across lenders to reduce the time. For a lot of these individuals, they're just one person, right? And so having the administrative burden and multiple applications is a challenge for them. And then just finally providing some greater transparency really around the decision-making process, as well as post-lending resources such as financial and leadership coaching. When these women are successful in terms of how they manage and operate their business, they are less likely to default on their loan and have, loan, late payments and things like that. So by addressing some of those key areas of interest and focus, that is part of the goal to total racial equity.
So Camaron, I'm going to have you weigh in, but I'm going to ask you to do a little bit extra because there's some important themes that have come up. So the first being that there has to be a power shift that happens as we pursue racial equity investing. And the second piece is this notion and conversation that we often have about risk and whose risk, when we talk about things like risk adjusted return, whose risk are we adjusting? And how much recognition do we give, given the legacy of this country, that the perceived risk that we often see, again, incorporates bias, right? We have these sort of built-in systems that has not allowed Black people and Brown people in this country to be able to compete, right, in a fair manner. So given your work and how you guys are engaging with communities, I'd love to hear you sort of address that as well, and then we can circle back.
Yeah, well said. I mean, the question gives me so much space to dream, right? Because when I think of systemic changes, I do think it starts with shifting that power. And I think the process of having some expansion of participatory budgeting where people could be at the table to really speak to this, what they want for their communities, what kind of infrastructure, what kind of help, what is essential now. And I think that is a shift of power that is needed in order to really make this for communities to get what they really need and what they want, right? And so I think you're spot on in thinking about that. And then I think the other piece of it is, and back to this measurement and thinking about the ROI of invested dollars, is once dollars are then spent on infrastructure, how do we measure if it's really adding value to a community, right? If it's building an economic development that displaces an historic community, that isn't really adding economic value to the overall community. It's not making the whole community's life better, really just kind of substituting residents for higher paying residents and transferring out communities. And so I think starting to think about the ROI of public safety spending, right? I think you think about some rich communities that spend 25% of their money on public safety, and then communities that are known to be or thought of as crime-ridden that spend 60%. How does that shift your ability to then spend on all the other stuff that you need in your community? And thinking about how the community that then spends 60% may have, because they have so much spending on public safety, an inclination to rely on fines and fees like we saw in Ferguson, or to have large settlement, multi-million-dollar settlements like we see in Louisville right now, or to have even worse DOJ consent decrees that end up in hundreds of millions of dollars. And if we think of those credit risk and expand it past how investors think of their duration or maturity in 5-7 years and extend it to the bonds I trade, which are 30, 50 years, you start to think about like, okay, how do we reevaluate what resiliency looks like when we take care of our whole community? And then how does that help to shift the balance of power back so that we can all kind of be in it together to build resilient, sustainable systems in all the neighborhoods, right? And not just in places where wealthy people have the ability to do that. The last piece, I think, of shifting that power is engaging bondholders to be allies to activists, right? And so having bondholders understand that they are also, on the hook for future decisions in a similar way, and that there are places where that, especially as we are impact aligned, as we are in this together and see a shift that is needed for bondholders to use their power to help communities kind of galvanize around what they really need to do. So those are the three places I see it. I kind of think we have to be in the beginning, having a real conversation. We have to measure it and really look at ROI on how we spend dollars. And we have to kind of all be in it together at the end, so that we're not just excluding bad actors, but shifting how policy and racial equity is being thought about and calculated, and how risk and returns are being thought about and calculated. So I think resilience as a city, as a community, especially in the world of impact over the last 2 years, has shown to be a credit benefit. And I think this is a great learning that we have here as an opportunity to understand the benefit of that going forward when we think about returns.
Great. So I'm going to open up the floor. And as you guys are sort of thinking about, your response to that, and sort of we're shifting this conversation. One of the things that you've pointed to, Humira, is this need to think in terms of longer term. And I know that oftentimes our 10 years that we think about are short or midterm. So how can we push investors to really consider the long-term risk? And I would often argue, as some of you may know, that with this demographic shift that we're seeing in the nation, that there is a risk to not acting now, to not investing in the communities that are going to be the majority in the future. And so, that has real implications, right, in terms of rule of law, which is important for a stable economy. It has implications for climate and how we again deal with climate and sort of the implications for that. So, as you sort of are coming back with your thoughts, would love to have you weigh in on those areas as well.
I'll start. I appreciate that question, and I think it's beyond the moral imperative for racial equity. I think as you were acknowledging, Charlene, there's a financial risk of inaction and being just kind of stuck in the old ways and models, and not taking into account the long-term economic health. And so I think we're going to need a lot more education and understanding on that. I think it will require some more open and honest conversations with engaging both the investors as well as communities in terms of transparent terms and fair returns and real versus perceived risk and those things. I think those of us on one of the most important things those of us on the call and others in our industry are doing is that we are building, and some of us have very long, we're building track records, right? Showing that you can not only successfully invest in low income and BIPOC communities, but that you can, also do deep engagement and, be a real partner, be transparent and be fair, and that there are ways to do that. And ultimately, I think that's beyond our strategies. We hope that really encourages more and more to get involved. I would just say one of the things that I'm, in your question that came to mind that I was really encouraged about beyond Croatan's important work in this area, but kind of the due diligence 2.0 commitment. Where kind of investors and advisors are committing to rethink their diligence and risk assessments that have led to majority of assets, right, continually flowing to many of the same firms that are overwhelmingly white, and getting some of the same outcomes, and sending some of the challenges further. So kind of how can we make sure that we include and evaluate BIPOC managers such that there's more equity in the allocation of capital. And I hope that is something, kind of the steps there and kind of rethinking risk management and due diligence will be important for more investors and advisors to get on board with.
I can go next. I think one of the opportunities that we all have as this field has grown and as the debate has been enriched is we can look for what are areas of philosophical questions and what are areas of right and wrong. So speaking of fixed income, which is our topic today, you can argue about what the optimal level of the home ownership rate is in our economy. And I certainly don't have a PhD. It's not my field. And there are people who say it should be this. There's people who say it should be that. There is some data that says that home ownership, when you get into an era of declining home values, which is possible. Some of the younger people on the call may not be aware of that, but they do go down as well as up. But that it can reduce labor force mobility. So forget about the absolute number. That's a philosophical topic. Should there be a delta between the white home ownership rate and the non-white home ownership rate? It doesn't seem like there's any philosophical component to that question. And the fact that we're at 2022 and there's still this gap, the racial wealth gap, is really in large part attributable to the gap in home ownership. And you look at how much home ownership has been an engine of wealth creation for those who've been on the escalator, and how much it has denied to people who have not been on the escalator. It just seems like that there is no argument to be made that would support a minority home ownership rate that is a statistically significant lower amount than the white home ownership rate. And so you look at the tools that investors have, and investors who are investing in the bond market, and let's stipulate that it's not the most sexy part of the investment arena, and that's just the choice that we've made to be in fixed income. But if you're investing in fixed income and you're doing the indexing thing, and you're investing in the Bloomberg Ag, which is the proxy for the bond market, you're investing in mortgage-backed securities. It's anywhere from 30 to 35% of that index. Are you asking the questions as to whether those mortgages are going to non-traditional borrowers, borrowers of color, low and moderate income borrowers? That's something that is absolutely on the table for discussion with, and I'm seeing there's some questions coming in about individual investors and their advisors, as well as institutional investors and their consultants. Because again, I would love to have somebody get up on a forum like this and make the case for why Black home ownership should be structurally lower in perpetuity than white home ownership. I hope that we're at a point where that's such an absurd notion that people would agree that if there are remedies for that, they're remedies that should be looked at and should be considered.
I'll just quickly chime in. I don't have much to add outside of what David and Justin just shared. I think their points are spot on, but specifically, I think something that we need to work really hard on and double down on is the point Justin raised around shifting power. Really, who's at the table and who is not at the table. If we continue to have conversations around the work that needs to be done for BIPOC communities of color, and we don't have those individuals represented at the table, that's a real problem. And that's what's got us to where we are today. And so, this is a period of transformation, right? A time for repair and a reality gut check that what has been done to this point is why we are where we are, and it's not a sustainable and a viable solution any further. And so, really thinking about how we can bring more BIPOC and communities of color to the conversations around the community. If we want to, what are the tools that are really going to help them be successful in their community, not thinking about, let me decide what's going to be helpful for them. And so just really, bringing more folks to the conversation. I think the Diligence 2.0 is a good way to start that in terms of the shift of power and how money is being allocated to managers for, working in the community. So I think the piece here that we really need to focus on is, who's at the table and who's not, and recognizing when the appropriate people are not there, full stop, and how do we get them there?
So thank you. Yeah, I think that those are all really good comments. I think the sort of the change. So I think, things like the due diligence 2.0 are great tools that do allow for greater diversity to move into the asset management space specifically. But Danielle, I think to your point, we actually have to have people living in the communities be at that table, because that is ultimately how we're going to get this right. And I love that. I love the fact that you guys did that human-centered design. I think much of this work around racial equity, I would argue, is very much it's an economic development agenda, right? The same type that I would have traditionally seen in microfinance. So much of what you said resonated with me, that women pay back better and better than men. These are sort of the same themes all throughout the world, right? It's not new information, but we have to constantly show the data. And so that brings me to, how do we know that we're successful, right? What are the metrics that you're tracking as you do your work that tells you that you're actually having the impact that you're working to achieve? So anyone who wants to start.
Well, I'll go first, because it just so happens in a happy coincidence that today Community Capital Management released our 2021 annual impact report. Something we've been doing now for 9 years, trying to make each report more transparent, more user-friendly than the one before. We even have a video this year, which shows how cutting edge we're getting, and what our clients ask of us, and what we encourage them to continue to ask of us, is that we be completely transparent. That not only are we saying at the threshold that we're impact investors and that we're do no harm investors, but that we're much more than that, that we're able to affirmatively place their money into the communities and into the impact themes that they ask us to do. And we do a lot of client-specific reporting, but then once a year, we roll up all of our investments that we've done across our portfolios and talk about the cumulative impact that we've had. And we're very much a part of an ongoing discussion within the space that I know a lot of the folks who are listening are part of, in terms of what are the impact metrics, what should we be measuring, what are the outcomes, who are the stakeholders, how are we tracking, and we think we do a good job, but we know we can always do better. So.
I'll just build on that. At Calvert Impact Capital, we've also recently released our impact report, and it has a lot of the metrics that we think are important for us in terms of kind of understanding our impact in community and making good investment decisions as well, but really seeing that impact. So whether it's kind of getting the demographic information of our managers at their kind of staff, board, and client level, to really trying to understand how they raise the community voice and how they engage their communities to really understand if they're advancing the impact that really furthers racial equity. Beyond kind of all the kind of measurement aspect, I think we look at our impact in a number of different ways. Just who's being invested in and who holds the power. Are the managers, diverse teams across race, gender, experience? Are we prioritizing those managers properly, and making sure that they're really deeply working on the ground with the communities they're serving? Do they have community stakeholders on committees, or how are they bringing in that end client voice? We really like to see that for sure. And I think, we also want to think about, how the communities experience the impact and how it's important to them. So, because that's really the outcome, right, of our investment, not just the providing of capital, but making sure that, the the roles that we're playing and our partners and communities are playing are really allowing people to grow their businesses and expand and hire employees and not just provide affordable housing, but is it allowing residents to feel secure and be able to save and build wealth? Not providing just capital to entrepreneurs, but thinking about technical assistance needs as well. To all of that, I think, is important to consider. It's not always as kind of metric focused as much in our industry. Is we try to put everything into metrics. Some of it's more qualitative, but I think it's important to really try to get that holistic and community-based level and continue to improve on the questions that we and the whole industry really can ask, so it's more collective systemic change.
Danielle.
Something that we are currently doing, which has actually been an amazing experience, is buying and investing alongside. So we do the research for a portfolio strategy called the Fiscal Justice Municipal Strategy. Adesina is the RIA that executes that strategy, and we do the research. And something that has been really beneficial is we've been able to test the hypothesis around giving access to capital to Black communities by directly investing in majority Black cities' municipal bonds and looking at use of proceeds, engaging with them around bondholder engagement, and then starting to measure impact for those communities. We look at a range of things across from jobs and income and disparity in income across race and gender, looking at fiscal health indicators to continue to see how and if those improve given the ROI investments by cities, and as well as clean water and education, and just finding measures within those to really understand how are cities trying to improve upon infrastructure that's been lacking for their Black population and marginalized communities. And so that's what we've been working on our end. Being invested in the strategy has been interesting to prove the concept to cities that, to Black communities, that someone is out here looking for your debt, right? Looking to lend you money and invest, and being met with, what is needed. And so it's been interesting.
And I'll just add, for C-Note, we really look to track and measure our impact across our entire portfolio as a way to maximize our efforts in kind of 3 key areas. And that's, first, we aim to listen as part of our diligence process. We really want to, understand what are for our portfolio partners, what are the intentions that they're trying to have, that they're trying to accomplish around social impact? What is their mandate and work around advancing racial equity? What does their ownership and their leadership look like? Are they representatives, right? Charlene, you said, are they representatives of the communities that they're serving? Are they, a minority deposit institution, et cetera? So we really want to understand and listen and learn from them. We want to align with other organizations. We don't want to pretend that we have all the answers figured out. And so we want to align some of our work with the UN SDGs as well as IRIS for a framework. One of the challenges that we have noticed in the industry is that there tends to be some bias with relation to how data is collected and measured. And so making sure that there's a standardized way that we're collecting and measuring our data. And then we want to do this work in collaboration. We know that, we can absolutely not do this alone. And so we seek to partner with other industry organizations or institutions to really measure how and where the impact is being made. But I think one of the most important parts of how we look to measure the success and the outcomes of our work is really by engaging specifically and directly with the borrowers, those individuals who are receiving this capital. And so for us, what that looks like is every quarter, we are connecting with an entrepreneur, right? We want to learn more about them, their specific story, how has this investment changed their lives, their family lives, the communities that they're, working in and they're serving. And really that for us is the truest way that we can, the truest form of measurement that we can provide when we connect directly with those individual entrepreneurs. So we're looking to think about things such as, percentages of, what are the percentages of women-led businesses? What percentage of our investment dollars are going specifically to LMI communities, creation of jobs are maintained, dollars that are going to BIPOC businesses, et cetera. But really, that truest form of measurement is coming from connecting with the borrowers directly.
That's great. And I think that piece is, I love the fact that there's this community level, borrower level, investment level focus, because ultimately that's the line of data that we need to be collecting to see if we're really having impacts. And I think that more of us in the space need to work towards that collection. And I absolutely agree with you, Danielle, that there can be a lot of bias in the data collection process. So leaning into systems and existing frameworks such as the SDGs is one that I personally support and encourage investors to highly think about, because we as a global society are working towards greater equity on a number of different levels. And so that's certainly one way that investors can at least begin that measurement journey if they are not doing so.
Charlene, I would also,
sure, go ahead.
Just want to add to elevate that point, something that we've found in having conversations with community members is that they have also data that other people are not aware of at all, right? How economic development is displacing residents, or how it's shifting the dynamic of their community, I'm just excited that you said that is really just not being talked about and not being looked at. And those voices are really needed in order for everyone to start, observing, right?
Yeah, fantastic. I am going to open it up to questions because Danielle has a hard stop at 3. So I know you said that there was a question for her, and so let me just sort of begin to work through, and then I'll circle back with my own if folks are being bashful. So I see a question here, so I'll just read it. Given that the Atlanta Fed repeatedly has stressed that systemic racism has and continue to dampen GDP, is shedding further light with studies mentioned here. Do those need to be amplified? And so to what degree are you guys trying to get information education out there?
Yeah, I think those of us on the call, we really see that that challenge and agree with what the Atlanta Fed governor said. I think we all need to continue to work to make that kind of data and research more accessible to a broader audience, right? Not all of us are following, the economic and financial news. So I think there's just a lot of work that we have to do to try to, help that be seen in a lot of different ways and tie it to how it affects all of us, right? And our communities and the future we want. I think there are huge, there's unknowns, but there are certainly economic costs if we don't take action that is needed to further racial equity. And I think that just hasn't been seen as clearly as some other things like the need to address climate change, right? More people have kind of experienced that or kind of seen it now in different ways. And, but I really hope that given what we've been through, communities of color have been through for so long, but kind of the heightened level of calls for action in the past couple of years, I hope that we do everything we can to make sure that doesn't let up, and that we continue to have deeper conversations that can be understood and experienced in different ways to kind of draw more, collective understanding that a lot more needs to be done.
Anyone else? I'd love to hear anything about investor education in particular came to mind for me, because that's one way of trying to get that information out there.
You know what we recently did? We did this panel in Louisville called there's a TIF development that's one of the largest in the country being pushed through in Louisville, and it's really gentrifying a historically Black neighborhood and displacing a lot of residents. And we recently participated in a panel to translate, right? Translate the numbers, translate the history, translate how it impacts the financing. People were shocked to find out they were responsible for the tax burden, right? And that's something that, municipal analysts take for granted, and citizens were like, what? Can't believe it, So I think just having that conversation, right? Because we're deep in the numbers. And it was helpful for me because I got out of the numbers and into a community and was engaged and put some tacticity to it, So, but yeah, I think trying to participate in panels, making sure people are aware of the numbers and the data, I think has been helpful. Even things like settlements and economic abatements, I think those are things that many people in their communities are just not aware of.
And I would just add, for those of you that don't read the Atlanta Fed or only skim it, one of the great changes in the last few years has been how much these issues specifically have been covered by people like Trevor Noah and other folks, in the cable news / advocacy business. And, you can go on YouTube and search on any one of the issues we've talked about, redlining, racial wealth gap, all of that, and you'll find something very easily digestible and yet with a lot of content to it. Certainly not something that I was exposed to in my earlier TV watching days.
So here's a question. So what is the fraction of private investment that is greed motivated versus the compassion motivated fraction that the panelists are apparently involved in? How might that be shifted? And so I think part of this might go to who your investors are and why they invest. So maybe some of you can talk about that.
Danielle, I know you have limited time, so if you want to take a crack.
Yeah, it's a good question, and oftentimes we, it's like, do we just focus on meeting folks where they are, in terms of what's their motivation in driving them? Is it because they're 100% all in? Is it because they're thinking this is just the sexy item at the moment? I don't know, I don't know if there's a magic number from where I sit. I don't know if there's a magic number in terms of greed versus compassion. I personally would like to err on the side of it's from a place of compassion and not greed. I don't think I have a strong answer for that, though, because, oftentimes you ask investors, what's their motivation, what's driving them to this change. I think that's an opportunity for us to really understand who people are as at the core of their investment decisions. What's keeping them up at night, what's their motivation, what gets them out of bed in the morning. I guess I'm the optimist, and I just choose to think that these decisions are based out of compassion and the opportunity to do what's right. So I don't know if that answers the question specifically, but that's just my take on it.
And thank you for joining us. I do know you have to hop in 2 minutes. I'm watching the time. Anyone else want to weigh in? Greed versus compassion.
Yeah, I think. Go ahead, Dave.
Nope, Justin, after you.
No.
All right. So, community capital management. A lot of folks that have been in the impact investing space for a long time, there's been this fight to say that you can do market rate investing and have a double bottom line. And I'm happy to declare victory there because we're all here and we're all sort of practitioners in one way or another of that. And there's it's almost a cliche now, but there's a thing that you say, every investment has impact, every economic decision has impact, every consumer decision has impact. Are you aware of what that impact is, or are there unintended consequences of your investments? And certainly there are a lot of well-meaning investors, let's give them the benefit of the doubt, who've made investments because their advisors said make the investment, and they were completely unaware going into them of the harm and the damage that was being done by those investments, whether it was climate change or perpetuating the structural racism we've been talking about on this call, the things of that sort. So as you become more aware as an investor or as a financial advisor of the prevalence of impact and the importance of impact, you widen your lens. And as you widen your lens, hopefully that includes, not super comfortable with the term greed, let's just say market rate bottom line investing, but also activities that people and institutions do with their philanthropy, and also very importantly with their below market investments, where they can be putting their money out in a way that maybe isn't getting the highest financial return, but is getting a deeper impact and a measurable impact, and it is very mission aligned or values aligned with what the investor is trying to do.
Yeah, I would just add quickly that I think, in working close with investors, everyone's on a little bit different part of the spectrum. And so I think it's a lot of kind of getting to understand investors and their motivation, kind of where they are in the spectrum of compassion and greed. Kind of, it's not always just that clear cut. Sometimes, they're institutions and they have specific fiduciary duties and other things that, again, probably also could be modernized to include more, but hopefully all of these investors care. And I think it's really trying to understand what are the impact goals that they have, how transformative do they want to be there, and what can be achieved on that impact level, what are their financial considerations, and what constraints does that pose? But I think the good news is that there are an increasing number of options, not just from those of us here on the call, to try to map where investors are interested and kind of the type of capital that they have, where it's housed, and all of that, kind of what those constraints are, to then say, all right, well, if you have this type of capital and it's here and all of that, here are some options for you. It might not be as transformative as if your money was over there, but there are some options that can, be more compassionate than what your current portfolio looks like today. I guess hopefully more impactful than what it looks like today.
That's helpful. And I do think that we're in this moment where we're all having to kind of reconcile and engage with the history more than I think we have in the past, the history of this nation. And so I have this working theory that we should be seeing what one might call more compassionate capital, right? Capital that sort of understands that many of us did not get where we are today, basically on our own merits, that we had a system that pushed us towards having sort of better standards of living. And so as a consequence, perhaps we have some responsibility in creating more equity. So I do feel like there's a perhaps shift, and maybe that's something that we should be watching for. Let me go to the next question, specifically for Camaron. What are the cities of color you've seen success in bond buying? Are there existing case studies? If this is something, or is this something that's still developing?
Yeah. So I have a whole list. All the cities are running through my mind right now, but
is there a resource that we can link to?
It's kind of proprietary, but I'm down to talk about some. But I would think Flint is probably the story that I think is like, gets me like, I was so sad, so angry. Now I'm like so hopeful, right? And so I think, Flint utility and how like Flint is trying to build infrastructure in a way that is through this municipal market is one example of a city that I'm really excited to invest in. And there are opportunities to invest outside of police bonds and other stuff, right? You can invest in the library or Flint Water. And I think those offer some interesting opportunities to be impact aligned in the kind of stuff you want and get market rate returns and likely higher returns. Black cities in the municipal market pay higher interest rates, and they usually pay for insurance, which usually costs like $100,000 or more. And so you're going to get higher rates and, insurance and all this other stuff as a burden to the cities because of the challenges around access to capital because of race. I think the city of Atlanta, DC, small cities like Bessemer, Alabama, and we have to keep in mind that all these HBCUs raised through the municipal market, Howard University and Spelman, North Carolina A&T and Alcorn State, and they're all out here, right? Bessemer, Alabama, and Jackson, Mississippi. There are so many places that Black communities live and need money to build infrastructure, and the list is long. The list is long. And so we've been really focusing on majority Black cities, with access to the municipal market that range all the way from big cities to very small cities and in between, and just trying to find specific investments that are going towards empowering those communities, elevating those communities, sustainable bonds for school districts, and things that are really easy to understand. Something we're pushing for is better understanding of use of proceeds for bonds, so that you can really see where a dollar goes in and a dollar comes out and see where it goes. I think it'll help measurements and impact and all of the ways. I don't know if I answered your question though.
I think it does. So thank you for the examples, because this was a participant question, and I do think that last comment gets to traceability, and so there definitely is a greater need, I think, in the investments, specifically in the fixed income space, given the narrative that you shared, and the degree to which we can do that. I think that there's real power to that. I think investing will be more critical. So the next question goes to everyone. So going beyond the market itself, to what degree have you been able to leverage this policy sphere at the municipal and state national level to amplify your work? Or has this been an obstacle? Policy implications or policy activism?
Can we say both? There are definitely laws and regulations that support the kind of work that community capital management does within the US capital markets. Thinking about things like Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Ginnie Mae that create instruments which Homero referenced, credit enhancement, where you can offload the risk and direct the money in some of the ways that we've been talking about. Call that a positive. Some of the social policies and laws and regulations, call that a negative. Whether it's government support of Redlining, which we've talked about already, or other citing decisions that have been made for housing policy and for where zoning has permitted various types of environmentally unfriendly industries to be put into less economically well off, but also more populated by people of color communities. So I'm going to go with a decided mixed bag on the answer there.
Yeah, I would say from the carbon impact capital perspective, we haven't been as active on the policy front in the past, but we certainly see the need to be more active going forward with others in the industry. I think, building from what David says, there are a number of other important policy things that have done so much for our industry, whether it's the Community Reinvestment Act or the CDFI fund and the creation of that and some of those flows. I think there's a lot more that can be done in terms of better economic development policy, better climate policy, that also advance racial equity because of the ties, bearing the brunt of climate change, as was said earlier. I think there's quite a bit more in the policy pipeline, so to speak, around small business financing and figuring out ways that at the policy level and at kind of the community implementation level that is prioritized to entrepreneurs of color. And lower income communities, I think, is important. So I think, policy is always hard and challenging. It's a mixed bag, as David said, but I think that there are a number of potential, policies at national and, and state and local levels that are important for us to know more about and be at the table. I think Camaron was saying earlier, kind of getting the community voice at the table is also going to be more important for all of us to figure out how to help see going forward.
I mean, I think it's transparency. I think this idea of having an understanding of just the fact that we have to go through a FOIA request to find out what public safety is costing its settlements, absurd, right? Like just little things that are part of our government financing that we have no idea how it's being spent or where, and the decisions that are being made. And I think having some clarity around that, having honest conversations with communities around how we're spending money and what it is doing in return, I think that is a policy shift that has started to happen and that I think needs to continue to happen in a big way. One thing that's happened is economic abatements has to be listed on all city CAFRs. And that's helpful, right? Just to understand, why we give a casino a real estate tax break, right? Like, where's it going? How many jobs they create for it? And then we can have a real conversation about it. So I think things like that around transparency are really starting to help shift it. I think also, that's from the city policy side, but I think there's investor policy that's shifting in a way, right? Around impact alignment. I think there was an Alabama prison deal that was tried to come to market not too long ago, earlier this year. And a lot of impact aligned investors were like, why are we doing this? And the bank that was doing it, their investors are like, you said you weren't doing this anymore. And we raised our hand, and a lot of people raised their hand. And I think there was a shift in policy on the investment side as well that helped to stop something like that from flourishing, right? And it may not stop it, but it will shift how it happens through municipal dollars, through community dollars. Yeah.
Thank you. I am aware of time, so I want to ask a final reflection question and give you each 30 seconds to a minute to perhaps respond. But this has been really a delightful conversation. I always feel like I come away learning something the more I listen to other folks speak about the work. So thank you on behalf of the team and the attendees. So here's the final question. So in 5 years, what would progress on racial equity look like in the United States? And what do you think are the observable changes that we should be seeing in our society? Want to take the lead, Homero? You were off mic. So.
I know, right? I was trying to dream it up. Oh, man. I think, what would racial equity look like 5 years from now? I'm going to dream big. Equal income, equal home ownership, equal access to capital, equal investment in our infrastructure, education, utilities, the right of way. I had a long list, but yeah. And you had a second part of that question because I got excited about the dream.
What are the observable changes? So how do we know that we're moving towards the right vision, right? Towards that end that you just created? What's the data points that get us there?
I mean, I think of this housing market as a great indicator. If we had in any given city, the fact that there are these pockets of like different house prices, not based on square footage necessarily, but based on zoning practices, the infrastructure available to those communities and who lives there. And if we had a shift where you lived in this city and nobody could say that was part of this town and this part of that town, it was just like that whole place is part of, I don't know, Durham's real estate market. And you couldn't make a difference between it. Access to capital for a mortgage would be the same no matter which part of town you lived in. I think that would be an observable way of like, appraisers didn't even need to show up. They're like, you live there, everybody there is worth 500 grand or whatever it is, like completely, yeah.
I'm going to challenge David and Justin to see if they can get it in 45 seconds each.
So building on everything that Homero said, for us, we look to put ourselves out of the business of one particular problem and move on to the frontier where the next one is. So we will see it in our day-to-day work at Community Capital Management. If the racial wealth gap goes away, we're not going to go out of business ourselves. Thank you very much. But we're going to try to, re-articulate and source the other areas where impact investors can truly and meaningfully have impact. I will say that I'm not worried about going out of business because the changes and the challenge that we're all facing is a large one. It's going to take a lot of time and quite a lot of money to redress.
So like those bigger picture thoughts, I think maybe more at the micro level, a couple of things that we'll hopefully see is that, we've really held the corporations accountable that have made such big commitments towards racial equity. I think we can do that as an investor community. I think we want to have the investment industry look different than it is today, and have more capital being allocated to managers of color that is at least more in line with national demographic representation. And then I think there's a whole bunch of policy goals we want to advance that won't cover in 5 seconds, but.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. I am aware that we have wrapped up our time. Thank you for attending. Thank you to the speakers, our sponsors, our partners, and all of the attendees. And certainly, if you would like to support our work, you can do so as a corporate sponsor or as a partner to our work, or you can simply make a donation. And to those who made donations, thank you again for that donation. Everyone have a great afternoon, evening, late morning. Thank you again. Bye.